This video is brought to you by Studio Brainstorm. Check out our website, buy our books. And if you have a story worth telling, please feel free to contact us. We're always on the lookout for new ideas. Thank you and enjoy. To quote one of my favorite anime YouTubers, Super Eyepatch Wolf, there was everything else, and then there was Akira. Hyperbolic? Possibly, but it does go to show the degree of reverence in which this film is held. Akira is perhaps one of, if not the most important anime film ever made, and I do not say this lightly, nor has any other anime fan that has said as much. You simply cannot discuss the history of anime or its fandom, especially in the West, without mentioning Akira. Not only was it among the first anime films to receive an, albeit limited, theatrical release, not only did it introduce an entire generation of nerds to the existence of Japanese animation, but it also redefined exactly what animation was capable of. Naturally, this raises a few questions. Why the reverence? What was it about this film that blew away so many nascent anime fans? What was it about this comic book that it motivated 7 different entertainment companies to spend a combined amount of 1.1 billion yen to make it into a movie? Why do we care about Akira? Of course, I must begin with the origin story. The first chapters of Akira were written in 1982 by one Katsuhiro Otomo, and were serialized that same year in a weekly anthology called Young Magazine. The timing is important here because the early 80s was a significant moment in the history of the anime industry, and at the risk of oversimplifying things, it mostly boiled down to 2 factors. The first was economics. Although Japan's economy had been slowly recovering ever since the end of the Second World War, it was by the 1980s that it really began to take off. In fact, by the end of the decade, Japan had the second largest economy in the world, just behind the United States. As a result, the average Japanese citizen found himself with a lot more disposable income than before, enough that he could afford to spend some of it on less than essential things like manga, anime, and video games, all of which were starting to break out into mainstream popularity around this time. The second factor was a changing of the guard within the anime industry itself. Although there had been animation and even comics prior to World War II, it was in the post-war period that anime and manga, as it is recognized today, truly began. Indeed, the 2 entertainment mediums were closely intertwined. Many early animators like Osamu Tezuka and Mitsuteru Yokoyama had begun in the comics business. By the 1980s, this generation of founding fathers was retiring and handing off the reins of the industry they had built to a new generation of creators eager to prove themselves. Otomo was part of this ambitious second generation, but the success of the Akira manga exceeded even his expectations. By the time he had written enough chapters to release in a single combined volume, or tankobon, sales jumped from the initial estimate of 30,000 all the way up to 300,000 copies. By the time he was approached with the idea of a film adaptation of his comic, he had printed 4 volumes, each selling 500,000 copies apiece. Otomo agreed to the project on condition that he have full creative control, up to and including directing the film himself. The film premiered in 1988, and while it didn't make all of its money back, it was successful enough that they decided to take a chance on the international market. The film was localized onto VHS in a limited theatrical release in 1991 in the English-speaking world, and the rest is history. Nowadays, Akira is regarded as a cultural touchstone in the anime fan community. Its success would later pave the way for franchises like Pokemon and Dragon Ball Z, and it has been cited by filmmakers ranging from the Wachowskis to Quentin Tarantino to even Christopher Nolan as an influence. So much praise has been heaped upon the film, in fact, that whenever I see a video devoted to Akira, it talks almost entirely about the film and ignores the comic book. A mistake that, if I may be so bold, I intend to rectify. On that note, let's begin. We begin with the technical side of the comic. Now, I've been reading comics in general, and Japanese comics in particular, ever since I was 12. And though I did stop buying comics after the first few years because I decided I wasn't really willing to spend my parents' money simply to indulge my hobby, my passion for it has never really died. To this day, comics remain my second favorite kind of story, books being number one, naturally. As such, I flatter myself that these 10 plus years of reading comics has given me enough of a perspective to judge Akira in comparison to others of its kind. From that perspective, I feel fairly confident in saying that in terms of technicals and sheer attention to detail, Akira may well be one of the best comics I've ever read, even 30 years later after it was first written. This is especially impressive when you consider that, apart from some uncredited assistance from another anime industry luminary, the late Satoshi Kon, Otomo did this almost entirely by himself. In Western comics, the general pattern is usually a two-man job, a writer and an artist. And with the very big studios like Marvel, DC, or Dark Horse, it's certainly not unheard of for there to be multiples of both on a single run. By contrast, Japanese comics are more often than not one-man projects, though mangaka that are especially successful can afford to hire assistants to help them with their work. This is especially helpful when your creation is a weekly serialization and you need all the help you can get just to meet those pitiless deadlines. In fact, much like video game development or even the anime industry itself, it is not uncommon for a mangaka to suddenly fall ill due to overwork. And taking that all into account makes the amount of detail that Otomo puts into every possible frame of Akira that much more impressive. Take some of these panels that are depicting the characters either at night or underground. It would be very easy for Otomo to simply draw the characters and any relevant props and just black out the background. Maybe add a floor or simple wall for the sake of perspective. But Otomo doesn't settle for such simplicity. He draws pipes and wires and pockmarks in the stone. He draws street lamps at night as distant specks. He draws entire nighttime cityscapes in meticulous detail. He draws piles of trash and debris amidst a wasteland. He does detailed close-ups. He draws wide-scale urban landscapes and crowd shots densely packed with people on the move. His art conveys emotion. It conveys movement. It conveys intimacy and desolation. I could probably devote most of this video just to describing all the ways in which Otomo conveys so much information in every single panel. For the sake of brevity, I will not do so. However, there is one exception, one specific part of Otomo's work that I feel requires further elucidation. Next. Among other things, Akira is a story about destruction. As such, perhaps the most arresting moments in the Akira comic are the scenes that depict such destruction, especially those on a massive scale. From explosions to collapsing buildings to massive telekinetic blasts. Then again, mass destruction is hardly a theme unique to Otomo. This is Japan, after all, a country whose most famous pop culture icon is a giant reptilian metaphor for the atomic bomb. However, as I reread all 6 volumes of Akira in preparation for this video, I came to realize that there is something that Otomo does in the way he depicts his destruction that very few comic artists do. He emphasizes the aftermath of destruction. Not only do we see the destruction itself rendered in Otomo's meticulous detail, but when it is done, Otomo will then devote multiple pages to depicting what comes after. He depicts buildings tottering on damaged foundations, water leaking from ruptured pipes, piles and heaps of debris, clouds parting overhead, dust blowing in a gentle breeze. This emphasis on consequence, in my view, makes the scenes of destruction in Akira that much more impactful. And it shows the amount of forethought that Otomo must have employed while writing this comic. It is nothing short of masterful. Next. Of course, all the beautiful artwork and well-rendered scenes of destruction don't really mean much if you don't care about the characters being affected by it. Fortunately, Akira has that in spades. The cast is fairly sizable, so for the sake of brevity, I'm going to limit myself to just 4. The main protagonists, Kaneda and Kei, Tetsuo, the primary antagonist, and the Colonel, who is the most significant secondary character. I will also briefly touch on Akira himself, though technically he's more of a living MacGuffin than an actual character. Kaneda is the closest this story comes to an actual main character, mostly because he serves as proxy for the reader, as he is often confused as to what exactly is going on, and will ask questions of other characters that the reader would very much like to ask. After, we are told, at the beginning of the story, where a giant explosion in 1992 consumed much of Tokyo and set off the Third World War, we are introduced to Kaneda in the year 2019 in the recently rebuilt city of Neo-Tokyo. Kaneda is the leader of a gang of juvenile delinquent bikers known as the Capsules. When they aren't being browbeaten by their teachers, they spend their free time riding around the city on their motorbikes, getting high and occasionally fighting with other gangs. During one such nightly escapade, Tetsuo, a member of Kaneda's gang, almost has a collision with a strange wrinkled child. It is later revealed that the child is in fact a powerful esper recently escaped from a government facility, and that the accident has awakened similar powers in Tetsuo. These powers soon go to Tetsuo's head in more ways than one, and he begins lashing out at everyone around him. This all comes to a head when Tetsuo goes completely rogue, and uses his new psychic powers to brutally kill almost every member of Kaneda's gang. This serves to set up one of the major conflicts of the story. From this point on, Kaneda's overriding goal is to kill Tetsuo and avenge their deaths. If I were to attempt to describe Kaneda in a simple phrase, the closest thing that I can think of, and boy doesn't this sound archaic for some reason, is likable scamp. As befitting his status as a juvenile delinquent, he often gets into trouble, he's crass, short-tempered, and rarely gives any thought for anything beyond the immediate. On the other hand, he has a good sense of humor, he's loyal to his friends, he's brave to the point of recklessness, and he rarely, if ever, lets things bother him. Sometimes even when they should be bothering him. There are also several instances where Kaneda demonstrates that, while not particularly intelligent, he is often more clever than he appears and can think quickly on his feet. For example, during his first run-in with the military and their psychics, he sees one trying to pass a pill to the other and immediately intuits that it is of some value to them and thinks to steal it, even though he has no idea exactly what it's for. In another scene, he pretends to molest Kei, only to use the action as cover so that he can steal her handgun. But perhaps the most significant thing about Kaneda is that he barely changes over the course of the story. By the end of Akira, he has assumed leadership of the survivors of Neo-Tokyo, and he's still very much the same person he was at the beginning when he was just running around the streets with his gang. In a way, his refusal to be daunted even in the face of such tremendous happenings may be Kaneda's most admirable quality. On the other hand, there is the other principal protagonist of the story, Kei. And in the beginning, she is shown very clearly to be Kaneda's polar opposite. As a member of an underground terrorist organization, she is intelligent, very serious, and driven. Indeed, her involvement with Kaneda is purely coincidental. She'd arranged to meet with the leader of her cell at the Harukiya, a small hole-in-the-wall dive frequented by Kaneda's gang. Kaneda saw a cute girl walk in the door and tried, unsuccessfully, to hit on her. While chasing after her, Kaneda stumbles onto the esper that caused Tetsuo's accident, only to discover that it was Kei and her allies that had smuggled him out of a military facility on the suspicion that he might be involved in something called the Akira project. And from that point on, the two are practically inseparable. Their relationship is initially rocky, as well as one-sided. But as the two work together to uncover the truth about the Akira project, as well as the military's interest in Tetsuo, Kei begins to, if reluctantly, reciprocate Kaneda's feelings. It is also revealed later on that while Kei has no psychic abilities of her own, she is what is called a medium, someone through whom espers can channel their own powers. This becomes especially relevant at the climax of the story, but I will address that later on. Unlike Kaneda, Kei changes significantly over the course of the story. Not only does her attitude toward Kaneda soften, but her perspective also changes significantly, as she experiences, in quick succession, betrayal, loss, and horror, as Neo-Tokyo is devastated once again. By the fourth volume, nearly all of her fellow terrorists are dead except for her guardian figure Chiyoko, and it's all that Kei can do just to survive from one day to the next. By the end of the story, she is just as determined to stop Tetsuo as Kaneda, but in her case, it's simply to ensure the survival of the few friends that she has left. She's just as goal-oriented as she was at the beginning of the story, but now her goals are a lot less high-minded, but also more personal. The next character of significance is the Colonel. He does have a name, but it's so rarely used in both versions that it's simply easier to refer to him by his rank. In the first volume, he fills the role of main antagonist, a high-ranking officer with ambitions to seize power from the Neo-Tokyo government, which, like Kei, he perceives as corrupt and ineffectual. He first encounters Kaneda and Kei while he is trying to recapture the escaped Esper. After discovering Tetsuo's awakened power, the Colonel thinks that maybe he can control him and use Tetsuo for his own ends. Over the course of Volume 2, however, Tetsuo's power grows rapidly beyond anyone's capacity to control him, and the Colonel can only watch helplessly as Tetsuo blows through his men and frees Akira from his decades-long cryosleep. Realizing what he may have just unleashed, the Colonel attempts to destroy both of them using a powerful satellite laser called Sol, but only succeeds in destroying one of Tetsuo's arms. After Neo-Tokyo is devastated halfway through the story, a guilt-ridden Colonel soon changes from being an enemy of Kaneda and Kei to an ally, convinced that, as the one that started it, he must be the one to finish Tetsuo once and for all. And then there's the titular Akira. Several decades ago, there was a government program intended to try and develop psychic powers in its test subjects, who just happened to be comprised of small children. While most of the subjects ended up either dead or mentally crippled by the experiments, a few, such as the priestess Lady Miyako and the 3 government espers known collectively as the Children, were able to survive and successfully awaken their powers, although the experiments seem to have left them all physically stunted as a result. Akira's awakening, however, was far more dramatic, or perhaps traumatic would be more appropriate. Not only did his awakening completely erase his personality, leaving him a mindless shell, but it also resulted in the explosion that destroyed Tokyo and started World War III. I said before that Akira is more MacGuffin than character, and I meant that. He's essentially little more than a walking bomb. He has no will of his own and only occasionally responds to stimuli. Though it is hinted that there might be something going on behind that blank stare, something too profound and terrible for an ordinary person to contemplate. I had intended to include Tetsuo in this section, but as I was recording it, in fact, I realized that I couldn't really talk about him without also addressing the major theme of Akira. On that note, if Akira has anything important at all to say, it is this: man seeks power and is ultimately destroyed by it. That is essentially Tetsuo's arc in a nutshell. Now, Tetsuo is certainly not the only thing that communicates this message. After all, the events of this story were set in motion years ago when the Japanese government decided to try experimenting with psychic potential, probably assuming that if they could, then they could just control it like any other tool. Only for Akira to awaken his power and have the whole thing literally blow up in their faces. Now, the idea of humanity messing with things that they really shouldn't is a sci-fi trope as old as Frankenstein. But the really interesting thing about Tetsuo is not so much what happens to him, but rather how he copes with it, or rather, how he tries to cope. Both Kaneda and Tetsuo were orphaned as little children, and indeed in those days it was Kaneda who defended Tetsuo from bullies, thus cementing their friendship. Unfortunately, this also caused Tetsuo to develop something of an inferiority complex towards Kaneda. And by the beginning of the story, he's come to the conclusion that the only way that he can prove he's no longer the little crybaby he used to be is by proving that he's better than Kaneda. This is what causes him to try and take the lead during their nightly ride, right before he nearly runs into the Esper. The society of Neo-Tokyo is a broken and dystopian one. Not only do Tetsuo and Kaneda not have families, but there also seem to be no adult authority figures that can offer them guidance. So, when Tetsuo becomes a psychic, he quickly comes to the conclusion that he can do what he wants with his powers, provided no one can stop him. And it soon becomes clear to him that no one really can stop him. Of course, as with all things, power comes at a price. Initially, this takes the form of immensely painful headaches that Tetsuo can only suppress by consuming what would otherwise be lethal amounts of drugs. But as time goes by, the power begins to grow even beyond his own abilities to control them. And it is this power that ultimately brings about his downfall. Tetsuo is more than just an angsty teen on a power trip gone wrong, however. Though initially he revels in his newfound powers, as they continue to grow beyond his control and the side effects grow worse, Tetsuo starts to become afraid of his abilities. He has no idea what it's doing to him or whether or not it'll stop. Things get even more complicated when he starts to form a bond with a meek, soft-spoken girl named Kaori. Though initially afraid of him, Kaori slowly begins to reciprocate his somewhat twisted affections for her. And as, like Akira before him, Tetsuo's mind begins to buckle under his immense psychic power, she becomes his one remaining link to his humanity. And surely some of that affection must be genuine, because when Tetsuo begins to lose control of his power completely, he begs Kaori to get away from him, lest he kill her by mistake. In the end, for all his immense power and menace, Tetsuo is very much a pitiable figure. Frankly, I'm of the opinion that he never really grew up beyond the scared little boy that Kaneda protected from bullies all those years ago. In fact, his last words before his mind goes completely is to beg Kaneda to save him. In some ways, one can argue that Tetsuo's fate was inevitable. In part because of the person he was, in part because of the circumstances that shaped him. He resented weakness in himself, and he sought power because he thought it would grant him validation. And in the end, he became just another example of the fact that no matter what the motive, power corrupts, and it ultimately destroys. Next. I've read the Akira comic multiple times, and personally, I've always found the midpoint of the story, volumes 3 and 4, to be my favorite. Mostly because I really like all the twists and turns that it throws at me. At the end of volume 2, Tetsuo has gone missing after the loss of his arm, and Kaneda and Kei have Akira in their custody. Kei initially tries to take Akira to her group's political backer, a shifty politician most appropriately named Mr. Nezu, who, it turns out, is also an agent for the mysterious priestess and psychic Lady Miyako. However, Nezu betrays both his employer and Kei when he decides that he can use Akira for his own purposes. From that point on, the whole volume is basically one big game of hot potato. You have the military, along with Nezu and Miyako's respective agents, all trying to capture Akira, while Kaneda, Kei, and Chiyoko all try to keep him out of everybody else's hands. There's quite a bit of action and suspense, as well as a few genuinely funny moments, like when the trio managed to hijack a tank and just drive straight on through a neighborhood, plowing through several houses as they go. In the end, it looks like the military has managed to win the game. But just then, an embittered Nezu, deciding that if he can't have Akira, then no one can, attempts to shoot him, but manages to kill one of the children instead. The psychic resonance of his death causes Akira to awaken and unleash his power once again. The center of Neo-Tokyo is consumed by yet another massive psychic blast, and the city is left in desolate ruin. Though the two remaining children are able to get most of the characters to safety, Kaneda is caught up in the blast and disappears. Volume 4 then opens up on a Neo-Tokyo that looks more like something out of Mad Max. Volume 4 is definitely the slowest of the volumes in terms of pacing. It has several plot threads, most of whom are pretty minor and some might even argue superfluous, but the two major ones are these. The first is Kei, the Colonel, the children, and Lady Miyako gradually forming an alliance against Tetsuo. The second major plotline being Tetsuo beginning to lose control of his powers, though this is somewhat mitigated by his relationship with Kaori. He does try, but ultimately the psychic migraines become too painful. He confronts Miyako, as well as Kei and Kaisuke, the last surviving member of Kaneda's gang, and as the pain finally overwhelms him, he unleashes a burst of psychic energy that somehow restores the section of the city that Akira blinked out of existence at the end of Volume 3. Of course, these buildings crash into the other buildings, causing even more devastation, but among the ruins is Kaneda. What I like most about Volume 4 is just how drastically the situation is changed after Neo-Tokyo's devastation, and how everyone has been affected by it, and how they struggle to survive in this new environment. There's also the added angle of how the other characters, particularly Kei, react to Kaneda's absence. Also, since this is the volume that introduces Kaori, we finally get to see that there's more to Tetsuo than just a power-crazed teen. Kaneda's sudden return at the end is just the cherry on top of an otherwise excellent story arc. And now that the gang is all back together again, now we can get down to brass tacks. Taken together, volumes 5 and 6 are essentially the third act of Akira. 5 being essentially the build-up to the climax, while Volume 6 is the climax itself, a climax that lasts over 400 pages. Which makes it all the more impressive when you realize that Volume 6 is so well paced that you can just breeze through the whole story and not feel like it took too long or went by too quickly. It really does feel like it's the culmination of everything that the other 5 volumes have been building up to this point. And I really do mean culmination here, as essentially Volume 5 is about everybody having a different plan to get rid of Tetsuo. First, there's Kaneda, who doesn't really have a plan other than kill Tetsuo. Again, he's clever, but not when it comes to planning. There's the Colonel, who's trying to re-establish connection with the satellite laser Sol to use that to kill Tetsuo. You have an additional side plot of the American military sending in a strike force to eliminate both Tetsuo and Akira. And finally, you have the remaining psychics, Miyako and the 2 children, approaching Kei with their own plan. Because Kei is a medium, they propose to essentially channel their powers through her and use her as a living weapon to fight Tetsuo. Kei agrees to the plan, and in a classic calm before the storm moment, comes to terms with her feelings about Kaneda and asks him to spend the night with her. Partly because, again, she might not survive this battle, and 2, Kaneda doesn't know about the plan and hopefully won't ask any awkward questions. But Kaneda, once again smarter than he looks, figures that something's off about this whole thing, and when he finally gets the truth out of her, he is none too pleased with the idea of his girlfriend being sent to her death by what he sees as a bunch of cowardly freaks. And so he resolves right then and there to go off and kill Tetsuo before he and Kei have to face each other. Though not before promising Kei that when he comes back, he won't spend just the one night with her. Not the most romantic declaration of love, but it is at least in keeping with his character. But of course, in the end, it's the chaos factor of Tetsuo's increasingly unstable powers that throws everyone's plans awry. I think that the only reason that Volume 6 can get away with being all climax is because it really does look and feel like everything is happening at once. Tetsuo fuses with things like battleships and fighter jets. There's destruction, explosions, characters dying, and of course, Tetsuo finally losing it completely. Though I still don't understand why it is that losing control of his powers turns him into a freaky combination of the Star Child from 2001, the Blob, and the Thing. In the end, Tetsuo is finally defeated by a combination of getting hit by the laser and the remaining children communing with Akira, causing him to awaken once again. But this time, instead of destroying everything, Akira absorbs Tetsuo. And after a final exchange between the children and Kaneda, who of course has gotten caught up in it because this seems to be a pattern with him, the psychics all disappear. and we are left once again with images of a ruined Neo-Tokyo. Though this time, there's more of a hopeful note. The story finally ends some months later, with Kei and Kaneda having taken leadership of the survivors, and they scare off the other countries from trying to invade by pretending that Akira is still alive. I suppose in the end, Otomo wanted to end the story on a more optimistic note, as if to say that yes, human beings tend to stumble into their own destruction. But at the same time, they are resilient and always find ways to hope, to keep going and aspire to a better tomorrow. Maybe even build that tomorrow. And in the end, maybe that is enough. A satisfying ending to a truly epic story. And so, at long last, we turn to the film. So, after that exhaustive and yet oversimplified summation of Akira the comic's many virtues, you're probably wondering, what does the film have to offer? How can it possibly add to something so monumental, a story so grand and epic? The truth is, in many ways, it doesn't. Even considering the fact that Otomo had yet to finish the manga when he went to direct the film, the plot is heavily truncated. It's essentially a mashup of volumes 1 and 2 with what Otomo would later make the ending of volume 6 tacked on at the very end. Several characters are either reduced in significance or omitted altogether. And while the movie does still depict a grand scale, it is not nearly to the same extent as the comic is able to depict. And it makes sense. The film is only 2 hours long, and while comics are as much a visual medium as film, like books and video games, they aren't bound by time in the same way that television, film, and radio are. But if that's the case, why then do so many people talk about the film almost to the exclusion of the source material? Well, you remember how I went over how amazing Otomo's artwork was? Take that same artwork, only now add color, sound, and most importantly of all, fluid motion. Absolutely amazing. It is important to remember here that anime, especially of an older period, was mostly known for being made on the cheap. In fact, many of the elements that make up the, quote, style of anime was the use of various time and money-saving techniques that were pioneered back in the 50s. So it really is something to see what can happen when an animated film has an actual budget behind it. There was also the fact that this was 1991. Doubtless, many a parent looked at the cover art, thought, cartoon, this must be good for children, popped it in the VCR, and then left to their kids to watch it. By themselves. Great parenting, idiots! All joking aside, and despite the fact that this term has been diluted through overuse, watching Akira in the early 90s must have been a truly mind-blowing experience for kids who were more accustomed to Disney films or the works of Don Bluth. More than anything else, it was these amazing visuals that cemented Akira's place in the pantheon of many anime fans' must-watch lists. Next. The main way in which the film gets around its truncated story is by narrowing its focus. Instead of the considerable cast of characters, the story of the film focuses almost entirely on the relationship and later conflict between Kaneda and Tetsuo. This is mainly achieved by fleshing out Tetsuo in a way that the comic never did. The reader never really gets much of a sense of the person that Tetsuo used to be before his powers awakened. He's simply shown early on in the first volume, and barely a dozen pages later he nearly crashes into the escaped psychic and his powers awaken. Meanwhile, in the film, our first encounter with Tetsuo is when he is examining Kaneda's bike, which he clearly perceives as a symbol of Kaneda's status as leader, as well as his resentment when Kaneda tells him that his bike is too much for anyone but himself to handle. In another scene, Tetsuo and Kaori, who is already his girlfriend in the film, discuss the idea of leaving Neo-Tokyo and starting a new life elsewhere. Both of these scenes are important, as in the comic we don't really learn much about Tetsuo's past until later, and only through exposition. Here, we are given a glimpse of the person that he used to be, before all was set in motion. It's an unfortunate omission in the comic that the film, thankfully, was able to rectify. Next. One other thing that the film adds to the story is include a greater emphasis upon Neo-Tokyo's decay. Aside from one terrorist attack and the graffiti defacing the school Kaneda attends, we don't see many examples of the unrest that's threatening to tear Neo-Tokyo apart. Meanwhile, in the film, we see multiple protests and demonstrations, as well as their violent suppression. In the film, Neo-Tokyo isn't simply decaying, it's spiraling out of control. It's a lot like Tetsuo in that regard. And just as his downfall and transformation into pure nightmare fuel is inevitable, so is the city's destruction inevitable. But the film, like the manga, does end on an ultimately hopeful note. Hopeful that man, foolish but ever resilient, may one day move past his flaws and seek a better tomorrow. The Akira manga is a story about humanity, its desire for power, its tendency towards destruction, but also its resilience in the face of destruction, and the possibility that it may recover and seek something better than what it currently has. The film tells a similar story, albeit truncated by the limitations of its running time. But while the film is somewhat lacking in comparison in story and characterization, with stunning visuals and immaculate animation. For kids in the 90s, accustomed to Disney films or Don Bluth movies, Akira must have hit like a megaton nuclear bomb. I remember a YouTube comment that once read, "Hey kids, anime used to be about getting your mind blown." And that is what Akira must have been at the time, a mind-blowing experience. an experience that broke through cultural barriers and made people think that there was more to animation than fairy tales and child-friendly experiences. This is why people are still talking about it over 30 years later. This is why there are people dedicated enough to make fan clips and trailers about it. This is where the reverence and awe comes from. This is why we care about Akira. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this video. Next episode, we'll be tackling a character so classic that his name is still recognizable 100 years after his creation. Next episode, we'll be talking about Zorro. Until then.